Max Horkheimer's Traditional and Critical Theory. What is theory? The question seems a rather easy one for contemporary science. Theory, for most researchers, is the sum total of propositions about a subject, the propositions being so linked with each other that a few are basic and the rest derive from these. The smaller the number of primary principles in comparison with the derivations, the more perfect the theory. The real validity of the theory depends on the derived propositions being consonant with the actual facts. If experience and theory contradict each other, one of the two must be re-examined. Either the scientist has failed to observe correctly, or something is wrong with the principles of the theory. In relation to facts, therefore, a theory always remains a hypothesis. One must be ready to change it if its weaknesses begin to show as one works through the material. Theory is stored up knowledge, put in a form that makes it useful for the closest possible description of facts. Poincaré compares science to a library that must ceaselessly expand. Experimental physics is the librarian who takes care of acquisitions, that is, enriches knowledge by supplying new material. Mathematical physics, the theory of natural science, in the strictest sense, keeps the catalogue. Without the catalogue, one would have no access to the library's rich contents. That is the role of mathematical physics. It must direct generalization so as to increase what I have called just now the output of science. The general goal of all theory is a universal systematic science, not limited to any particular subject matter, but embracing all possible objects. The division of sciences is being broken down by deriving the principles for special areas from the same basic premises. The same conceptual apparatus, which was elaborated for the analysis of inanimate nature, is serving to classify animate nature as well, and anyone who has once mastered the use of it, that is, the rules of derivation, the symbols, the process of comparing derived propositions with observable fact, can use it at any time, but we are still rather far from such an ideal situation. Such, in its broad lines, is the widely accepted idea of what theory is. Its origins supposedly coincide with the beginnings of modern philosophy. The third maxim in Descartes' scientific method is the decision to carry on my reflections in due order, commencing with objects that were the most simple and easy to understand, in order to rise little by little, or by degrees, to knowledge of the most complex, assuming an order, even if a fictitious one, among these which do not follow a natural sequence relative to one another. The derivation, as usually practiced in mathematics, is to be applied to all science. The order in the world is captured by a deductive chain of thought. Those long chains of deductive reasoning, simple and easy as they are, of which geometricians make use in order to arrive at the most difficult demonstrations, had caused me to imagine that all those things which fall under the cognizance of men might very likely be mutually related in the same fashion, and that, provided only that we abstain from receiving anything as true which is not so, and always retain the order which is necessary in order to deduce the one conclusion from the other, there can be nothing so remote that we cannot reach to it, nor so recondite that we cannot discover it. Depending on the logician's own general philosophical outlook, the most universal propositions from which the deduction begins are themselves regarded as experiential judgments, as inductions, as with John Stuart Mill, as evident insights, as in rationalist and phenomenological schools, or as arbitrary postulates, as in the modern axiomatic approach. In the most advanced logic of the present time, as represented by Edmund's logical investigations, theory is defined as an enclosed system of propositions for a science as a whole. Theory, in the fullest sense, is a systematically linked set of propositions taking the form of a systematically unified deduction. Science is a certain totality of propositions, emerging in one or other manner from the theoretical work and the systematic order of which propositions a certain totality of objects acquires definition. The basic requirement which any theoretical system must satisfy is that all the parts should intermesh thoroughly and without friction. Harmony, which includes lack of contradictions and the absence of superfluous, purely dogmatic elements which have no influence on the observable phenomena, are necessary conditions according to Weil. Insofar as this traditional conception of theory shows a tendency, it is towards a purely mathematical system of symbols. As elements of the theory, as components of the propositions and conclusions, there are ever fewer names of experiential objects and ever more numerous mathematical symbols. Even the logical operations themselves have already been so rationalized that, in large areas of natural science at least, theory formation has become a matter of mathematical construction. The sciences of man and society have attempted to follow the lead of the natural sciences with their great successes. The difference between those schools of social science which are more oriented to the investigation of facts and those which concentrate more on principles has nothing directly to do with the concept of theory as such. The assiduous collecting of facts in all the disciplines dealing with social life, the gathering of great masses of detail in connection with problems, the empirical inquiries, through careful questionnaires and other means, which are a major part of scholarly activity, especially in the Anglo-Saxon universities since Spencer's time, all this adds up to a pattern which is outwardly much like the rest of life in a society dominated by industrial production techniques. Such an approach seems quite different from the formulation of abstract principles and the analysis of basic concepts by an armchair scholar, which are typical, for example, of one sector of German sociology. Yet these divergences do not signify a structural difference in ways of thinking. In recent periods of contemporary society, the so-called human studies have had but a fluctuating market value and must try to imitate the more prosperous natural sciences, whose practical value is beyond question. There can be no doubt, in fact, that the various schools of sociology have an identical conception of theory, and that it is the same as theory in the natural sciences. Empirically oriented sociologists have the same idea of what a fully elaborated theory should be as their theoretically oriented brethren. The former, indeed, are persuaded that in view of the complexity of social problems and the present state of science, any concern with general principles must be regarded as indolent and idle. If theoretical work is to be done, it must be done with an eye unwaveringly on the facts. There can be no thought in the foreseeable future of comprehensive theoretical statements. These scholars are much enamored of the methods of exact formulation, and in particular of mathematical procedures, which are especially congenial to the conception of theory described above. What they object to is not so much theory as such, but theories spun out of their heads by men who have no personal experience of the problems of an experimental science. Distinctions like those between community and society, mechanical and organic solidarity, or culture and civilization, as basic forms of human sociality, prove to be of questionable value as soon as one attempts to apply them to concrete problems. The way that sociology must take in the present state of research is, it is argued, the laborious ascent from the description of social phenomena to detailed comparisons, and only then to the formation of general concepts. The empiricist, true to his traditions, is thus led to say that only complete inductions can supply the primary propositions for a theory, and that we are still far from having made such inductions. His opponent claims the right to use other methods, less dependent on progress in data collection, for the formation of primary categories and insights. Durkheim, for example, agrees with the many basic views of the empirical school, but in dealing with principles, he opts for an abridgment of the inductive process. It is impossible, he claims, to classify social happenings on the basis of purely empirical inventories, nor can research make classification easier in the way in which it is expected to do so. Its, inductions, role is to put into our hands points of reference to which we can refer other observations than those which have furnished us with these very points of reference. But for this purpose, it must be made not from a complete inventory of all the individual characteristics, but from a small number of them, carefully chosen. It will spare the observer many steps because it will guide him. We must, then, choose the most essential characteristics for our classification. Whether the primary principles are gotten by selection, by intuition, or by pure stipulation makes no difference, however, to their function in the ideal theoretical system. For the scientist must certainly apply his more or less general propositions as hypotheses to ever new facts. The phenomenologically oriented sociologist will indeed claim that once an essential law has been ascertained, every particular instance will, beyond any doubt, exemplify the law. But the really hypothetical character of the essential law is manifested as soon as the question arises whether in particular case we are dealing with an instance of the essence in question or a related essence, whether we are faced with a poor example of one type or a good example of another type. There is always, on the other hand, the conceptually formulated knowledge, and on the other hand, the facts to be subsumed under it. Such a subsumption or establishing of a relation between the simple perception or verification of a fact and the conceptual structure of our knowing is called its theoretical explanation. We need not enter here into the details of the various kinds of classification. It will be enough to indicate briefly how the traditional concept of theory handles the explanation of historical events. The answer emerged clearly in the controversy between Edward Mayer and Max Weber. Mayer regarded as idle and unanswerable the question of whether, even if certain historical personages had not reached certain decisions, the wars they caused would nonetheless sooner or later have occurred. Weber tried to show that if the question were indeed idle and unanswerable, all historical explanation would become impossible. He developed a theory of objective possibility based on the theories of the physiologist von Kreis and of writers in jurisprudence and national economy such as Merkel, Liefman, and Radbirch. For Weber, the historian's explanations, like those of the expert in criminal law, rest not on the fullest possible enumeration of all pertinent circumstances, but in the establishment of a connection between those elements of an event which are significant for historical continuity and particular determinative happenings. This connection, for example, the judgment that a war resulted from the policies of a statesman who knew what he was about, logically supposes that, had such a policy not existed, some other effect would have followed. If one maintains a particular causal nexus between historical events, one is necessarily implying that, had the nexus not existed, then, in accordance with the rules that govern our experience, another effect would have followed in the given circumstances. The rules of experience here are nothing but the formulations of our knowledge concerning economic, social, and psychological interconnections. With the help of these, we reconstruct the probable course of events, going beyond the event itself to what will serve as explanation. We are thus working with conditional propositions as applied to a given situation. If circumstances A, B, C, and D are given, then event Q must be expected. If D is lacking, event R. If G is added, event S, and so on. This kind of calculation is a logical tool of history, as it is of science. It is in this fashion that theory in the traditional sense is actually elaborated. What scientists in various fields regard as the essence of theory thus corresponds in fact to the immediate tasks they set for themselves. The manipulation of physical nature and of specific economic and social mechanisms demand alike the amassing of a body of knowledge, such as is supplied in an ordered set of hypotheses. The technological advances of the bourgeois period are inseparably linked to this function of the pursuit of science. On the other hand, it made the facts fruitful for the kind of scientific knowledge that would have practical application in the circumstances, and, on the other, it made possible the application of knowledge already possessed. Beyond doubt, such work is a moment in the continuous transformation and development of the material foundations of that society. But the conception of theory was absolutized as though it were grounded in the inner nature of knowledge as such, or justified in some other ahistorical way, and thus it became a reified ideological category. As a matter of fact, the fruitfulness of newly discovered factual connections for the renewal of existent knowledge and the application of such knowledge to the facts do not derive from purely logical or methodological sources, but can rather be understood only in the context of real social processes. When a discovery occasions the restructuring of current ideas, this is not due exclusively to logical considerations, or more particularly to the contradiction between discovery and particular elements in current views. If this were the only real issue, one could always think up further hypotheses by which one could avoid changing the theory as a whole. That new views, in fact, win out is due to concrete historical circumstances, even if the scientist himself may be determined to change his views only by imminent motives. Modern theoreticians of knowledge do not deny the importance of historical circumstance, even if among the most influential non-scientific factors they assign more importance to genius and accident than to social conditions. In the 17th century, for example, men began to resolve the difficulties into which traditional astronomy had fallen, no longer by supplemental constructions, but by adopting the Copernican system in its place. This change was not due to the logical properties alone of the Copernican theory, for example, its greater simplicity. If these properties were seen as advantages, this very fact points beyond itself to the fundamental characteristics of social action at that time. That Copernicanism, hardly mentioned in the 16th century, should now become a revolutionary force as part of the larger historical process by which mechanistic thinking came to prevail. But the influence of the current social situation on change in scientific structures is not limited to comprehensive theories like the Copernican system. It is also true for special research problems in everyday life. Sheer logic alone will not tell us whether the discovery of new varieties in particular areas of inorganic or organic nature, whether in the chemical laboratory or in paleontological research, will be the occasion for modifying old classifications or for elaborating new ones. The theoreticians of knowledge usually rely here on a concept of theology which only in appearance is immanent to their science. Whether and how new definitions are purposefully drawn up depends in fact not only on the simplicity and consistency of the system, but also, among other things, on the directions and goals of research. These last, however, are not self-explanatory, nor are they, in the last analysis, a matter of insight. As the influence of the subject matter on the theory, so also the application of the theory to the subject matter is not only an intra-scientific process, but a social one as well. Bringing the hypotheses to bear on facts is an activity that goes on, ultimately, not in the savant's head, but in industry. Such rules as that coalter under certain conditions becomes colored, or that nitroglycerin, saltpeter, and other materials have great explosive force, are accumulated knowledge, which is really applied to reality in the great industrial factories. Among the various philosophical schools, it is the positivists and the pragmatists who apparently pay most attention to the connections between theoretical work and the social life process. These schools consider the provision and usefulness of results to be a scientific task, but in reality, this sense of practical purpose, this belief in the social value of his calling, is a purely private conviction of the scholar. He may just as well believe in an independent, suprasocial, detached knowledge as in the social importance of his expertise. Such opposed interpretations do not influence his real activity in the slightest. The scholar and his science are incorporated into the apparatus of society. His achievements are a factor in the conservation and continuous renewal of the existing state of affairs, no matter what fine names he gives to what he does. His knowledge and results, it is expected, will correspond to their proper concept. That is, they must constitute theory in the sense described above. In the social division of labor, the savant's role is to integrate facts into conceptual frameworks and to keep the latter up to date so that he himself and all who use them may be masters of the widest possible range of facts. Experiment has the scientific role of establishing facts in such a way that they fit into theory as currently accepted. The factual material or subject matter is provided from without. Science sees to its formulation in clear and comprehensible terms, so that men may be able to use the knowledge as they wish. The reception, transformation, and rationalization of factual knowledge is the scholar's special form of spontaneity, namely theoretical activity, whether there is question of as detailed as possible an exposition of a subject as in history and the descriptive branches of other special disciplines, or of the synthesis of masses of data and the attainment of general rules as in physics. The dualism of thought and being, understanding and perception is second nature to the scientist. The traditional idea of theory is based on scientific activity as carried on within the division of labor at a particular stage in the latter's development. It corresponds to the activity of the scholar which takes place alongside all the other activities of a social, but in no immediately clear connection with them. In this view of theory, therefore, the real social function of science is not made manifest. It speaks not of what theory means in human life, but only of what it means in the isolated sphere in which, for historical reasons, it comes into existence. Yet, as a matter of fact, the life of society is the result of all the work done in the various sectors of production. Even if, therefore, the division of labor in the capitalist system functions but poorly, its branches, including science, do not become for that reason self-sufficient and independent. There are particular instances of the way in which society comes to grips with nature and maintains its own inherited form. They are moments in the social process of production, even if they be almost or entirely unproductive in the narrower sense. Neither the structures of industrial and agrarian production, nor the separation of the so-called guiding and executory functions, services and works, or of intellectual and manual operations are eternal or natural states of affairs. They emerge rather from the mode of production practiced in particular forms of society. The seeming self-sufficiency enjoyed by work processes, whose course is supposedly determined by the very nature of the object, corresponds to the seeming freedom of the economic subject in bourgeois society. The latter believe they are acting according to personal determinations, whereas, in fact, even in their most complicated calculations, they but exemplify the working of an incalculable social mechanism. The false consciousness of the bourgeois savant in the liberal era comes to light in very diverse philosophical systems. It found an especially significant expression at the turn of the century in the neo-Kantianism of the Marburg School. Particular traits in the theoretical activity of the specialist are here elevated to the rank of universal categories, of instances of the world mind, the eternal logos. More accurately, decisive elements in the social life are reduced to the theoretical activity of the savant. Thus, the power of knowledge is called the power of creative origination. Production means the creative sovereignty of thought. For any datum, it must be possible to deduce all its determinations from theoretical systems and ultimately from mathematics. Thus, all finite magnitudes may be derived from the concept of the infinitely small by way of the infinitesimal calculus, and this process is precisely their production. The ideal to be striven for is a unitary system of science, which, in the sense just described, will be all-powerful. Since everything about the object is reduced to conceptual determinations, the end result of such theoretical work is that nothing is to be regarded as material and stable. The determinative ordering, unifying function, is the sole foundation for all else, and towards it all human effort is directed. Production is production of unity, and production is itself the product. Progress in awareness of freedom really means, according to this logic, that the paltry snippet of reality which the savant encounters finds ever more adequate expression in the form of differential quotients. In reality, the scientific calling is only one non-independent element in the work or historical activity of man, but in such a philosophy, the former replaces the latter. To the extent that it conceives of reason as actually determining the course of events in a future society, such a hypostatization of logos as reality is also a camouflaged utopia. In fact, however, the self-knowledge of present-day man is not a mathematical knowledge of nature which claims to be the eternal logos, but a critical theory of society as it is, a theory dominated at every turn by a concern for reasonable conditions of life. The isolated consideration of particular activities and branches of activity, along with their contents and objects, requires for its validity an accompanying concrete awareness of its own limitations. A conception is needed which overcomes the one-sidedness that necessarily arises when limited intellectual processes are detached from their matrix in the total activity of society, and the idea of theory which the scholar inevitably reaches when working purely within his own discipline, the relation between fact and conceptual ordering of fact, offers a point of departure from such a corrective conception. The prevailing theory of knowledge has, of course, recognized the problem which this relation raises. The point is constantly stressed that identical objects provide for one discipline problems to be resolved only in some distant future, while in another discipline they are accepted as simple facts. Connections which provide physics with research problems are taken for granted in biology. Within biology, physiological processes raise problems while psychological processes do not. The social sciences take human and non-human nature in its entirety as given and are concerned only with how relationships are established between man and nature and between man and man. However, an awareness of this relativity, immanent in bourgeois science, and the relationship between theoretical thought and facts, is not enough to bring the concept of theory to a new stage of development. What is needed is a radical reconsideration, not of the scientist alone, but of the knowing individual as such. The whole perceptible world as present to a member of bourgeois society, and as interpreted within a traditional worldview, which is in continuous interaction with that given world, is seen by the perceiver as a sum total of facts. It is there and must be accepted. The classificatory thinking of each individual is one of those social reactions by which men try to adapt to reality in a way that best meets their needs. But there is at this point an essential difference between the individual and society. The world which is given to the individual and which he must accept and take into account is, in its present and continuing form, a product of the activity of society as a whole. The objects we perceive in our surroundings, cities, villages, fields, and woods, bear the mark of having been worked on by man. It is not only in clothing and appearance, in outward form and emotional makeup, that men are the product of history. Even the way they see and hear is inseparable from the social life process as it has evolved over the millennia. The facts which our senses present to us are socially performed in two ways: through the historical character of the object perceived, and through the historical character of the perceiving organ. Both are not simply natural, they are shaped by human activity, and yet the individual perceives himself as receptive and passive in the act of perception. The opposition of passivity and activity, which appears in knowledge theory as a dualism of sense perception and understanding, does not hold for society, however, in the same measure as for the individual. The individual sees himself as passive and dependent, but society, though made up of individuals, is an active subject, even if a non-conscious one, and to that extent, a a subject only in an improper sense. This difference in the existence of man and society is an expression of the cleavage which has up to now affected the historical forms of social life. The existence of society has either been founded directly on oppression or been the blind outcome of conflicting forces, but in any event, not the result of conscious spontaneity on the part of free individuals. Therefore, the meaning of activity and passivity changes according to these concepts are applied to society or to individual. In the bourgeois economic mode, the activity of society is blind and concrete, that of individuals, abstract and conscious. Human production also always has an element of planning to it. To the extent, then, that the facts which the individual and his theory encounter are socially produced, there must be rationality in them, even if in a restricted sense. But social action always involves, in addition, available knowledge and its application. The perceived fact is therefore co-determined by human ideas and concepts, even before its conscious theoretical elaboration by the knowing individual. Nor are we to think here only of experiments in natural science. The so-called purity of objective event to be achieved by the experimental procedure is, of course, obviously connected with technological conditions, and the connection of these in turn with the material process of production is evident. But it is easy here to confuse two questions. The questions of the mediation of the factual through the activity of society as a whole, and the question of the influence of the measuring instrument, that is, of a particular action upon the object being observed. The latter problem, which continually plagues physics, is no more closely connected with the problem that concerns us here than is the problem of perception generally, including perception in everyday life. Man's physiological apparatus for sensation itself largely anticipates the order followed in physical experiment. As man reflectively records reality, he separates and rejoins pieces of it, and concentrates on some particulars while failing to notice others. This process is just as much a result of the modern mode of production as the perception of a man in a tribe of primitive hunters and fishers is the result of the conditions of his existence, as well, of course, as of the object of perception. In this context, the proposition that tools are prolongations of human organs can be inverted to state that the organs are also prolongations of the tools. In the higher stages of civilization, conscious human action unconsciously determines not only the subjective side of perception, but in larger degree the object as well. The sensible world, which a member of industrial society sees about him every day, bears the mark of deliberate work. Tenement, houses, factories, cotton, cattle for slaughter, men, and in addition, not only objects such as subway trains, delivery trucks, autos, and airplanes, but the movements in the course of which they are perceived. The distinction within this complex totality between what belongs to unconscious nature and what to the action of man in society cannot be drawn in concrete detail. Even where there is question of experiencing natural objects as such, their very naturalness is determined by contrast with the social world, and to that extent, depends upon the latter. The individual, however, receives sensible reality as a simple sequence of facts into his world of ordered concepts. The latter, too, though their context changes, have developed along with the life process of society. Thus, though the ordering of reality by understanding and the passing of judgment on objects usually take place as a foregone conclusion and with surprising unanimity among members of a given society, yet the harmony between perception and traditional thought, and among the monads or individual subjects of knowledge, is not a metaphysical accident. The power of healthy human understanding or common sense, for which there are no mysteries, as well as the general acceptance of identical views in areas not directly connected with class conflicts, as for example in the natural sciences, are conditioned by the fact that the world of objects to be judged is in large measure produced by an activity that it is itself determined by the very ideas which help the individual to recognize that world and to grasp it conceptually. The doctrine of purely passive sensation and active understanding suggests to him the question of whence the understanding derives its assured expectation that the manifold given in sensation will always obey the rules of the understanding. He explicitly rejects the thesis of a pre-established harmony, a kind of preformation system of pure reason, in which reason has innate and true rules with which objects are in accord. His own explanation is that sensible appearances are already formed by the transcendental subject, that is, through the activity of reason, when they are received by perception and consciously judged. In the most important chapters of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant tried to give a more detailed explanation of the transcendental affinity, or subjective determination of sensible material, a process of which the individual is unaware. The difficulty and obscurity which, by Kant's own admission, mark the sections on the deduction and schematism of the pure concepts of understanding may be connected with the fact that Kant imagines the supra-individual activity, of which the individual is unaware, only in the idealist form of a consciousness in itself, that is a purely intellectual source. In accordance with the theoretical vision available in his day, he does not see reality as product of a society's work which taken as a whole is chaotic, but at the individual level is purposeful. Where Hegel glimpses the cunning of a reason that is nonetheless world historical and objective, Kant sees an art concealed in the depths of the human soul, whose real modes of activity nature is hardly likely ever to allow us to discover and to have open to our gaze. At least Kant understood that behind the discrepancy between fact and theory which the scholar experiences in his professional work, there lies a deeper unity, namely the general subjectivity upon which individual knowledge depends. The activity of society thus appears to be a transcendental power, that is, the sum total of spiritual factors. However, Kant's claim that its reality is sunk in obscurity, that is, that it is irrational despite all its rationality, is not without its kernel of truth. The bourgeois type of economy, despite all the ingenuity of the competing individuals within it, is not governed by any plan. It is not consciously directed to a general goal. The life of society as a whole proceeds from this economy only at the cost of excessive friction in a stunted form, and almost, as it were, accidentally. The internal difficulties in the supreme concepts of Kantian philosophy, especially the ego of transcendental subjectivity, pure or original perception, and consciousness in itself, show the depth and honesty of his thinking. The two-sidedness of these Kantian concepts, that is, their supreme unity and purposefulness on the one hand, and their obscurity, unknownness, and impenetrability on the other, reflects exactly the contradiction-filled form of human activity in the modern period. The collaboration of men in society is the mode of existence which reason urges upon them, and so they do not apply their powers and thus confirm their own rationality. But at the same time, their work and its results are alienated from them. The whole process, with all its waste of work power and human life, and with its wars and all its senseless wretchedness, seems to be an unchangeable force of nature, a fate beyond man's control. In Kant's theoretical philosophy, in his analysis of knowledge, this contradiction is preserved. The unresolved problem of the relation between activity and passivity, a priori and sense data, philosophy and psychology, is therefore not due to purely subjective insufficiency, but is objectively necessary. Hegel discovered and developed these contradictions, but finally resolved them in a higher intellectual realm. Kant claimed that there existed a universal subject, which, however, he could not quite describe. Hegel escaped this embarrassment by postulating the absolute spirit as the most real thing of all. According to him, the universal has already adequately evolved itself and is identical with all that happens. reason need no longer stand over against itself in purely critical fashion. In Hegel, reason has become affirmative, even before reality itself is affirmed as rational. But confronted with the persisting contradictions in human existence and with the impotence of individuals in face of situations they have themselves brought about, the Hegelian solution seems a purely private assertion, a personal peace treaty between the philosopher and an inhuman world. The integration of facts into existing conceptual systems and the revision of facts through simplification or elimination of contradictions are, as we have indicated, part of a general social activity. Since society is divided into groups and classes, it is understandable that theoretical structures should be related to the general activity of society in different ways according as the authors of such structures belong to one or other social class. Thus, when the bourgeois class was first coming into being in a feudal society, the purely scientific theory which arose with it tended chiefly to the breakup of the status quo and attack the old form of activity. Under liberalism, this theory was accepted by the prevailing human type. Today, development is determined much less by average men who compete with each other in improving the material apparatus of production and its products than by conflicting national and international cliques of leaders at the various levels of command in the economy and the state. Insofar as theoretical thought is not related to highly specialized purposes connected with these conflicts, especially war and the industry that supports it, interest in theory has waned. Less energy is being expended on forming and developing the capacity of thought without regard to how it is to be applied. These distinctions, to which others might be added, do not at all change the fact that a positive social function is exercised by society, in its traditional form, that is. The crucial examination of data with the aid of an inherited apparatus of concepts and judgments, which is still operative in even the simplest minds, as well as the interaction between facts and theoretical forms that goes on in daily professional activity. In this intellectual work, the needs and goals, the experiences and skills, the customs and tendencies of the contemporary form of human existence have all played out their part. Like a material tool of production, it represents potentially an element not only of the contemporary culture totality, but of a more just, more differentiated, more harmoniously organized one as well. To the extent that this theoretical thinking does not deliberately lend itself to concerns which are external and alien to the object, but truly concentrates on the problems which it meets in the wake of technical development and, in this connection, itself turns up new problems and transforms old concepts where necessary. To this extent, it may rightly regard the technological and industrial accomplishments of the bourgeois era as its own justification and be confident of its own value. This kind of theoretical thinking considers itself to belong to the realm of hypothetical, of course, not of certainty. But the hypothetical character is compensated for in many ways. The uncertainty involved is no greater than it need be, given the intellectual and technological means at hand at any given time with their proven general usefulness. The very elaboration of such hypotheses, however small their probability may be, is itself a socially necessary and valuable accomplishment which is not at all hypothetical. The construction of hypotheses and theoretical activity in general are kind of work which, in present social circumstances, has a real usefulness. That is, there is a demand for it. Insofar as it is underpaid or even neglected, it only shares the fate of other concrete and possibly useful kinds of work which have gotten lost in the present economy. Yet these very kinds of work presuppose the present economy and are part of the total economic process as it exists under specific historical conditions. This has nothing to do with the question of whether scientific labor is itself productive in the narrow sense of the term. In the present order of things, there is a demand for an immense number of so-called scientific creations. They are honored in very varying ways, and part of the goods emerging from strictly productive work is handed over for them, without anything at all being thereby settled about their own productivity. Even the emptiness of certain areas of university activity, as well as all the idle ingenuity and the construction of metaphysical and non-metaphysical ideologies, have their social significance no less than do other needs arising out of social conflicts. However, they do not therefore further the interests of any important large sector of society in the present age. An activity which, in its existing forms, contributes to the being of society need not be productive at all, that is, be a money-making enterprise. Nevertheless, it can belong to the existing order and help make it possible, as is certainly the case with specialized science. We must go on now to add that there is a human activity, which has society itself for its object. The aim of this activity is not simply to eliminate one or other abuse, for it regards such abuses as necessarily connected with the way in which the social structure is organized. Although it itself emerges from the social structure, its purpose is not, either in its conscious intention or in its objective significance, the better functioning of any element in the structure. On the contrary, it is suspicious of the very categories of better, useful, appropriate, productive, and valuable as these are understood in the present order, and it refuses to take them as non-scientific presuppositions about which one can do nothing. The individual, as a rule, must simply accept the basic conditions of his existence as given and strive to fulfill them. He finds this satisfaction and praise in accomplishing as well as he can the tasks connected with his place in society, and in courageously doing his duty despite all the sharp criticism he may choose to exercise in particular matters. But the critical attitude of which we are speaking is wholly distrustful of the rules of conduct with which society, as presently constructed, provides each of its members. The separation between individual and society, in virtue of which the individual accepts as natural the limits prescribed for his activity, is relativized in critical theory. The latter considers the overall framework which is conditioned by the blind interaction of individual activities, that is, the existent division of labor and the class distinctions, to be a function which originates in human action and therefore is a possible object of planful decision and rational determination of goals. The two-sided character of the social totality in its present form becomes, for men who adopt the critical attitude, a conscious opposition. In recognizing the present form of economy and the whole culture which it generates to be the product of human work as well as the organization which mankind was capable of and has provided for itself in the present era, these men identify themselves with this totality and conceive it as well and reason. It is their own world. At the same time, however, they experience the fact that society is comparable to non-human natural processes, to pure mechanisms, because cultural forms which are supported by war and oppression are not the creations of a unified self-conscious will. That world is not their own, but the world of capital. Previous history thus cannot really be understood. Only the individuals and specific groups in it are intelligible, and even these not totally, since their internal dependence on an inhuman society means that even in their conscious action, such individuals and groups are still in good measure mechanical functions. The identification, then, of men of critical mind with their society is marked by tension, and the tension characterizes all the concepts of the critical way of thinking. Thus, such thinkers interpret the economic categories of work, value, and productivity exactly as they are interpreted in the existing order, and they regard any other interpretation as pure idealism. But at the same time, they consider it rank dishonesty simply to accept the interpretation. The critical acceptance of the categories which rule social life contains simultaneously their condemnation. This dialectical character of the self-interpretation of contemporary man is what, in the last analysis, also causes the obscurity of the Kantian critique of reason. Reason cannot become transparent to itself as long as men act as members of an organism which lacks reason. Organism, as a naturally developing and declining unity, cannot be a sort of model for society, but only a form of dead-end existence from which society must emancipate itself. An attitude which aims at such an emancipation and at an alteration of society as a whole might well be of service in theoretical work carried on within reality as presently ordered, but it lacks the pragmatic character which attaches to traditional thought as a socially useful professional activity. In traditional theoretical thinking, the genesis of particular objective facts, the practical application of the conceptual systems by which it grasps the facts, and the role of such systems in action are all taken to be external to the theoretical thinking itself. This alienation, which finds expression in philosophical terminology as the separation of value and research, knowledge and action, and other polarities, protects the savant from the tensions we have indicated and provides an assured framework for his activity. Yet a kind of thinking which does not accept this framework seems to have the ground taken out from under it. If a theoretical procedure does not take the form of determining objective facts with the help of the simplest and most differentiated conceptual systems available, what can it be but an aimless intellectual game, half conceptual poetry, half impotent expression of states of mind? The investigation into the social conditioning of facts and theories may indeed be a research problem, perhaps even a whole field of theoretical work, but how can such studies be radically different from other specialized efforts? Research into ideologies or sociology of knowledge, which has been taken over from the critical theory of society and established as a special discipline, is not opposed either in its aim or in its other ambitions to the usual activities that go on within classificatory science. In this reaction to critical theory, the self-awareness of thought as such is reduced to the discovery of the relationship that exists between intellectual positions and their social location. Yet the structure of the critical attitude, inasmuch as its intentions go beyond prevailing social ways of acting, is no more closely related to social disciplines thus conceived than it is to natural science. Its opposition to the traditional concept of theory springs in general from a difference not so much of object as of subject. For men of the critical mind, the facts, as they emerge from the work of society, are not extrinsic in the same degree as they are for the savant or for members of other professions, who all think like little savants. The latter look towards a new kind of organization of work. But insofar as the objective realities given in perception are conceived as products which in principle should be under human control, and in the future at least, will in fact come under it, these realities lose the character of pure factuality.